안녕하십니까. 아시아개발은행에서 온 박신영이라고 합니다. 먼저 저를 이 자리에 불러주신 저401 이사장님, 그리고 이민재 여성경제연합 회장님, Dr. Norbert Eschborn, Head of Korean Representative Office of the German Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, 모두 감사드리고요. 그리고 또 여기 와서 이렇게 각계각처에서 역량을 발휘하고 계시는 많은 여성 지도자분들을 만나게 돼서 굉장히 영광입니다. Well, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the female labor participation around the world, especially focusing on developing Asia, and what would be the appropriate sort of policies and strategies to promote female labor participation to promote the growth potential. In fact, the female labor force participation around the world varies quite significantly across different countries, different regions. And as you can see, in ADB, DMC is developing member countries of Asian Development Bank, and the average of ADB DMCs sit sort of very close to the Latin American developing countries, and it performs a little better compared to Middle Eastern countries or North Africa. But when it compares to the developed economies and the European unions, in terms of the female labor participation, it's lagging slightly. And women are also paid much less compared to men. We would have actually liked to show, like, if these are for the same job, but in fact, this is just the raw data. We're just comparing the average wages for men and then average wages for women. And then it also shows that there are quite of different degrees of discrepancies in terms of how women get compensated for their work across the world. Even in Asia, in fact, the female labor force participation varies quite significantly. And if you look at the Korea in the red bar, it's below the OECD average, and then it is also below the middle income average. What's interesting in labor force participation patterns across different income levels around the world is that if you are actually the very low income countries, the labor force participation rates tend to be higher because the women by necessity have to be participating a lot of the rural households, like in the agriculture area, informal employments. So when there is a needs, when there's a really low income that sort of forces everybody to participate in the workplace, women are forced into going this labor market. But then when the income level increases as the economy develops, the women's labor force participation declines. And around the middle income, that in a way the women is sort of given that luxury, being able to stay home. A lot of times it is then forced by the social norm and the country culture context that sort of requires woman and wife to stay at home and then support the family. When the economy grows even further and then the income level actually rises even further, then at around the high-income countries, that the labor force participation rates start to increase again. But nevertheless, these female labor force participation particularly tend to stagnate given the income level, despite the the growth of the economy, also despite the, the rising sort of education level, despite the rising sort of like a female empowerment, also despite falling fertility rate, women has less sort of responsibility for the child care as the number of children the women have. Nonetheless, the female labor force participation has a little bit of struggle to pick up over the middle income country level. And it is quite striking, in fact, that across many of these developing Asian countries, that education doesn't really seem to guarantee an increase in female labor force participation. Enrollment rates, especially for the girls compared to boys, have been increasing quite a bit across the different developing member countries in Asia, and also there are also these advancement to higher education increased quite a lot in many developing countries in Asia. But nonetheless, it didn't really seem to directly affect the level of female labor force participation in many developing countries. So what are the obstacles then to these female labor force participation rates? There are various reasons, of course. There's the supply side constraints, there's demand side constraints. The women providing the labor to the market faces constraint. The society, employers demanding labor from women also poses some constraints on the female labor participation. There are wage gaps and occupational segregation. I think there was this the joke I heard when I was younger about the boy got hurt and then went to the hospital. Everybody thinks the doctor is actually male. So there's this perception of what type of jobs are open to women. So these sort of the perception also matter a lot for the female labor force participation. And also, strikingly, in fact, some parts of difference in the labor force participation may be explained by the limited investment in female human capital from young. The many girls face more constraints and then barriers to obtaining necessary education. But in fact, much of them just cannot be explained empirically. It shows that there is a significant residual differences that are related to the social norms and perceptions. So there's a long list of factors why the female labor force participation is kept low across different countries. And these are largely endogenous, and they are also highly interrelated. On the supply side, there's of course the opportunity cost of work, especially for women, because there's household responsibilities, childcare, and also other household income level, like as somehow the wife's salary level doesn't really necessarily affect whether or not the husband joins the labor market, but it doesn't really work the same the other way around. If the husband makes adequate income, somehow it actually works against female labor force participation. And there are also various social costs. It's different country context and the cultural context. There's a stigma attached to women working outside. Some countries actually have a significant constraint on mobility. And also women have inadequate sort of social network, being able to participate in the public workplace. On the demand side, the female wages and then the male wage gaps are quite significant. There's still discrimination at the workforce and also comparative disadvantages against women. Work environment is not flexible enough. There's also sometimes abuses and then harassments. Opportunities for growth and advancements are quite limited for women. And there's difficulties of commuting to workplace when the work is far away from home, especially some countries where the mobility is significantly constrained. So the policies have been really trying to address these constraints on various sort of aspects. First, you can think of like changing the economic returns, right? Like let's try to have equal wages for equal jobs, and maybe there's also like these efforts of increasing the female wages, but effect seems to be a bit ambiguous because the women have a unique responsibility of child care, and there's also this difficulty in substituting the child care responsibility from the household perspective. So there's a U-shape of this, as I mentioned, that the U-shape of the female labor force participation that we saw, because the income level grows to some extent that it sort of discourages women from participating in the labor market. There's also efforts to change social norms and trying to promote flexibility arrangement in the workplace. This works much better, I think, in a way, in the middle income and then above, that reducing the discrimination associated with work also increases the labor supply, reducing opportunity cost of foregone home production, being able to hire the helpers at home also is going to be useful. And the influencing the social norms by promoting the role models. Women tend to do better, tend to participate better, more active when there are more examples. It's not easy to be the first woman in everything. And somehow I believe that in the 80s and 90s, actually, also this. In a way, you kind of like many established women in Korea have gone through this. First woman in a lot of things. You have to be the first in every, and there is always much bigger barrier and cost to be the first. And if the social norms are not there, you have to be making your own social norm to be first in something. It adds the burden on women. And also in many countries in the region, the mobility and the safety protections are also significant issues, imposing the barrier to the female labor force participation. On the demand side, also, there's from companies' perspective, that there's a differences between the individually optimal level of female labor force participation and socially optimal level of female labor force participation. So overall, maybe in your own sort of a company that is right now you feel that there is enough chances of hiring anybody you like, but then that discrimination in wages and then hiring will lead to misallocation of talent for the overall economy, and it can lead to the lower economic growth. So then this sort of the gap between this the individually optimal choices and then the socially optimal choices have to be, again, filled up by the public interventions. Many have looked at these areas, in fact, empowerment, women's empowerment and the female labor force participation. In fact, the study sort of shows that empowerment doesn't necessarily lead to the higher female labor force participation per se, but it really helps in a way, leading women being compensated at the same level as women, as men. So there's an equal pay for equal job seem to be related to the with the women empowerment. And also the social norms in many countries that these result in a different outcomes of female labor force participation. The household responsibilities and childcare are met in a very different sort of individual country and then the cultural context. So it is quite important that policies do target women with this the childcare responsibility as a primary activity, and it also has to tackle the issues of limited mobility in especially many developing countries in South Asia, and then also that those might be more important in countries like Korea, as I think now everybody now see this the M-shaped Korean female labor force participation graph almost in every presentation. So that that child care responsibility in Korea is disproportionately largely falling on women, and then that is really the country specific in a way. So a lot of the policy measures that target the female labor force participation have to be designed and implemented in a very country specific framework. Overall, studies actually show that the high female labor force participation could contribute increasing the welfare and economic growth. And different countries have introduced also different sort of policy measures and strategies. Some are noted here, quite widely used. First is the skills and vocational training for women in many developing countries. And second, the gender employment quotas. You can introduce a specific sort of quotas to hiring women. And also the trade openness. Some countries actually show that the foreign participation and export-oriented industrial the base have been positive for female employment, and also reducing the gender wage gap. So given that many of these gender issues and then the policies to address these issues are country specific, we have undertaken a study very recently on the gender and development. Our study wanted to look at more carefully what would be the economic sort of costs and benefits of gender inequality in selected developing member countries. So the countries included China, India, Indonesia, and Korea and Pakistan. And as we expected, of course, there are some country-specific barriers to labor force participation. India, the cultural norms tend to restrict the upper caste, the Hindus and Muslims. In Indonesia, wage gaps have been reduced, but then still the labor market discrimination is persistent. And in Pakistan, the mobility restriction is a significant barrier to women participating in the workplace. And in China, there's a high migration, and there's actually high female labor force participation, but the quality jobs are limited for women. How about in Korea? Well, Korea has seen a substantial progress in terms of the equal opportunities in education and the entry-level employment during its rapid rapid industrialization and development. There's actually a negligible gap in employment ratios at the secondary school or higher, and a more significant presence of women in professional jobs like in law, medicines, and then high-level civil services. But nevertheless, significant gender gap exists in labor force participation. Only about 55% of Korean women are in the labor force, below the OECD average of 65%. And women in Korea faces, again, much more challenges in participating in the economic activities compared to the world average or compared to the North America, US, Canada average. And women are also heavily limited in terms of the political empowerment. While we have achieved quite remarkably in terms of the educational attainment and then health and social sector the advancement. So again, in terms of the average of years of schooling, women caught up, at least in Korea. But in terms of labor force participation, we're still losing out. In professional and technical workers, when it comes down to the more professional and non-technical jobs, Korea is still not, Korean women are not represented equally. This comes really, really bad when it comes to the legislators, senior officials, and manager level. Our study presents the model to analyze how the gender inequality at home and the labor market affects the female labor force participation and economic growth. And the study actually shows that, if we have this is an ideal world that only works in economic model. With a complete elimination of a gender inequality, the female labor force participation could reach nearly as high as the government target of 70%. And it could also increase the nearly 10% of GDP per capita growth in growth terms. And also, final slide. Another study that was done in relation to this, the ADB study, found that the child care in Korea is particularly considered a difficult one to substitute, that actually present some challenges and barriers to women's participation. So income itself doesn't really necessarily guarantee an increase in the female labor force participation. So policy measures really have to focus on continuity and the flexibility of jobs. And it really has to focus much more the barriers that are specific to Korea. Two things: quality job for women. We need quality job for women. I remember one the panelist in the morning actually mentioned that men consider female labor force participation as sort of taking job away from men. It's not. Our goal has to be creating a quality job for more people. The effort has to be increasing the pie, rather than let's keep the pie and then let's just fight over which share who gets. And second, what's really important is flexibility. And I couldn't agree more when the Miss Jackson said it has to be flexibility for everybody. If it is a flexibility for only us, limited group, doesn't matter if it's man or woman, it will never work. So two things: quality job for women, flexibility in the workplace. Thank you.